On the surface, they were the perfect family, living the American dream. A successful Irish businessman, his American wife, and two adorable kids in a beautiful home in North Carolina. But in the early hours of August 2nd, 2015, that dream didn't just shatter, it was annihilated. The official story? Jason Corbett was killed by his wife, Molly Martens, and her father, a retired FBI agent, in a desperate act of self-defense. But the forensic evidence, the story the crime scene tells when you look close enough, tells a completely different story. It's a story of unimaginable brutality and cold, calculated deception. Tonight, we aren't just retelling a tragedy. We're going to uncover the evidence that was meant to stay buried and reveal what I believe really happened to Jason Corbett. Jason Corbett was a man who had already faced heartbreaking loss. Originally from Limerick, Ireland, he was a devoted father to his two young children, Jack and Sarah. In 2006, their world collapsed when Jason's first wife and the children's mother, Mags, died suddenly from a severe asthma attack. Suddenly a widower in his early 30s, Jason's only goal was to give his kids a stable, loving home. In 2008, he hired a young American woman from Tennessee, Molly Martens, to be their live-in au pair. Molly was in her 20s and seemed perfect, quickly forming a bond with Jack and Sarah. Soon, the professional relationship between Jason and Molly became a romantic one. They married in 2011, and Jason made a huge, life-altering decision. He moved his entire family from Ireland to the United States, settling in a large house in Walburg, North Carolina. To anyone looking in, it was a fairy tale second chance, a family rebuilt from tragedy. They had a beautiful home in a wealthy neighborhood, and Jason's business was doing great. But behind the closed doors of their house on Panther Creek Court, a much darker reality was taking shape. One that would end in an act of violence, so extreme it left even seasoned investigators completely stunned. Just after 3 a.m. on August 2nd, 2015, a 911 call came in from the Corbett house. The man on the line was 65-year-old Thomas Martens, Molly's father and a 30-year FBI veteran. That call, which stretched on for nearly 14 minutes, would become one of the first and most analyzed pieces of evidence in the whole case. Tom Martens calmly told the dispatcher, "My son-in-law got in a fight with my daughter. I intervened, and he's in bad shape. We need help." Then he added a truly chilling line. "He's bleeding all over, and I may have killed him." When paramedics and deputies arrived, they walked into an absolute bloodbath. Jason Corbett was on the floor of the master bedroom, naked and unresponsive, his head horrifically beaten. Molly and her father were there, and they immediately launched into a story that was suspiciously clear and unified. Tom claimed he and his wife were sleeping in the guest room when they were woken by a struggle and his daughter's screams. According to him, he grabbed a 28-inch aluminum baseball bat, one he claimed he brought as a gift for his grandson Jack, and ran upstairs. He told police that he walked in to find Jason with his hands around Molly's throat, screaming, "I'm going to kill you." Tom said he hit Jason with the bat to make him let go of his daughter. He claimed a struggle followed, and at some point, Molly grabbed a concrete landscaping brick, which she insisted was on her nightstand for an art project, and hit her husband with it. Their story was simple. It was textbook self-defense. A father protecting his daughter from a violent, raging man. They had no other choice. It was either Jason's life or theirs. And for a little while, that was the story everyone heard. A tragic domestic dispute that ended in death. But as investigators started digging, that official story began to fall apart, revealing holes you just couldn't ignore. Cops and paramedics developed a kind of sixth sense for when a crime scene just feels wrong. And the scene at the Corbett home was screaming that something was off. The very first red flag was Tom Martens himself. On the 911 call, he claimed he was performing CPR on Jason. But when first responders got there, they all noted his demeanor was surprisingly calm. He wasn't out of breath, frantic, or hysterical. Pretty strange for a guy who'd supposedly just fought for his daughter's life and then tried to save the man he'd beaten. Then there was Jason's body. Some of the EMTs later testified they thought Jason's body was too cold for the timeline the Martens were giving. This raised a disturbing question of whether there had been a long delay between the attack and the 911 call, a delay that could have been used to get their story straight. But maybe the most obvious problem was Molly and Tom Martens. They claimed they had just been in a brutal life-or-death fight against an enraged man. Yet, neither of them had any real injuries. Molly had a little redness on her neck, but none of the telltale signs of a serious strangulation attempt. Tom Martens was completely unmarked. For investigators, this was a huge red flag. A struggle as violent as they described would almost certainly leave marks on everyone involved. One officer even noted he saw Molly repeatedly rubbing her own neck, almost as if she was trying to create the very marks that would prove her story. The bedroom was a scene of utter carnage. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the bed, the floor. But the story being told by the only two other people there just wasn't adding up. The pieces didn't fit. And this was the moment everything changed. This was when investigators stopped looking at this as a clear case of self-defense and started seeing for what the evidence suggested it really was: a brutal and calculated murder. When a story falls apart, you turn to the science. You turn to forensics. Because while people can lie, blood spatter and bone fractures tell the truth. And the forensic evidence in Jason Corbett's bedroom told a story that was a million miles away from self-defense. Let's start with the weapons: a 28-inch aluminum baseball bat and a concrete paving brick. The idea of the brick just sitting on a nightstand for a kid's art project just felt weird. It was a weapon of convenience that seemed way too convenient. But it was the sheer, relentless brutality of the attack that completely destroyed the self-defense claim. The official autopsy was horrifying. Jason Corbett had been struck in the head at least 12 times. His skull was so utterly shattered that the medical examiner, Dr. Craig Nelson, testified he couldn't even count the exact number of blows because the impacts just overlapped. It was described in court as looking less like a fight and more like the aftermath of a car crash. A juror reportedly had to run out of the courtroom to be sick after seeing the photos. Dr. Nelson stated that several of the blows would have been fatal on their own. This wasn't hitting someone until they stopped being a threat. This was overkill. This was a frenzied, savage attack designed to make sure of one thing: that Jason Corbett was never getting up again. But the single most damning piece of forensic evidence was the blood spatter analysis. It's a field of science that can reconstruct a violent crime with shocking accuracy. When investigators analyzed the blood patterns on the walls and furniture, they found the nail in the coffin for the self-defense story. The analysis proved that most of the blows to Jason's head happened when his head was only 12 to 18 inches from the floor. Let that sink in. Jason wasn't standing up. He wasn't fighting back. He wasn't choking Molly when he was being beaten over and over again. He was already down. He was on or near the ground, helpless and likely unconscious, when his skull was crushed. They even found blood spatter on the underside of the bedspread, suggesting the attack started while he was still in bed. This one scientific fact changes everything. It flips the narrative from a desperate struggle for survival into a cold-blooded execution. It wasn't a fight, it was a beating, and it was a beating that kept going long after any possible threat was gone. Once the forensics established the timeline, other parts of the deception started to click into place. The story the Martens told was built on lies, and the evidence was knocking it all down. Remember the cop who saw Molly rubbing her neck? Her claim of being strangled was the whole foundation of their self-defense argument, but the physical evidence was incredibly weak. There were no petechiae, those tiny broken blood vessels in the eyes that are a classic sign of serious strangulation, and no real bruising. It looked, for all the world, like a staged injury. Then there was the evidence found literally in Jason's own hand. Crime scene photos showed what looked like at least one long, blonde hair clutched in his fist, which likely belonged to Molly. This could have been a game-changing piece of evidence, possibly showing a struggle from Jason's side of the story. Incredibly, this hair was never tested or even brought up by the prosecution in the first trial, a detail the defense later hammered on. It's still a frustrating loose end in a case that's full of them. And that brings us to the most tragic part of this story. The children. Jack was 10 and Sarah was 8, and they were sleeping in the house as their father was being killed. Right after it happened, they gave statements to social workers that seemed to back up Molly's story. saying their father had anger issues and was abusive. These statements became the cornerstone of the defense's case. But months later, after they were back in Ireland with their aunt, the children recanted. They said Molly had coached them on exactly what to say. The thought that two grieving children were allegedly manipulated into smearing their own father's name to protect his killers is almost too dark to imagine. It points to a level of deception that is just truly chilling. Every piece of the puzzle, from the calm 911 call to the position of Jason's body, pointed away from the Martin story. It pointed to a staged crime scene, faked injuries, and a desperate cover-up. So why, if it wasn't self-defense, why would Molly and Tom Martens commit such a horrific act of violence? As investigators dug into the Corbett's lives, a powerful, three-part motive started to take shape. Custody, money, and control. The first and biggest issue was custody of the children. Jason was reportedly very homesick and was making serious plans to move back to Ireland with Jack and Sarah. For Molly, this was her worst nightmare. Even though she'd raised them for years, she wasn't their biological mother and had failed in her attempts to legally adopt them. Jason's was crystal clear. If he died, his sister Tracy and her husband in Ireland would become their legal guardians. If Jason moved the kids back to Ireland, Molly would lose them for good. Then there was the money. Jason Corbett had a $600,000 life insurance policy, and Molly was the beneficiary. While the defense argued this is normal for a married couple, the prosecution saw it as a massive financial incentive, especially when tied to the custody fight. Losing the children, but gaining a fortune. It's a powerful motive for murder. Finally, there was the issue of control. Prosecutors looked into Molly's past and presented evidence that she had a history of making things up to get sympathy or control a situation. She allegedly told people she had given birth to Sarah, that she had a sister who died of cancer, and even that she was friends with Jason's first wife, Mags. This showed a pattern of someone willing to invent her own reality to get what she wanted, and what she wanted more than anything were Jason's children. The prosecution argued that on that August night, it all came to a head. Molly found out Jason's plan to leave was real and happening soon. Her father was in town. It was their last chance. They weren't defending themselves from an attack. They were launching one. The prosecution argued getting rid of the one person standing between Molly and the life she felt she deserved, a life with Jack and Sarah, and the money to go with it. The amount of evidence that flies in the face of the official story is just staggering. We've walked through forensics, the inconsistencies, and the motive. It all paints a very clear and very dark picture. If you're finding this investigation as compelling as I do, and you believe in getting the truth out there, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel keep doing these deep dives. Now, let's get back to what happened when all this evidence was finally presented in court. In the summer of 2017, Molly and Tom Martens went on trial for the second-degree murder of Jason Corbett. The prosecution laid out the case we'd just gone through, the forensic evidence of overkill, the blood spatter that proved Jason was on the ground, the clean bill of health for the defendants, and the powerful motive of custody and cash. The defense stuck to their story, self-defense against a violent abuser. After a tense trial, the jury took less than 4 hours to come back with a verdict. They found both Molly Martens and Tom Martens guilty of second-degree murder, and they were sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison. For Jason's family, it finally felt like justice. His name was cleared, and his killers were being held responsible. But that feeling didn't last long. The Martens lawyers immediately started appealing. And in 2021, in a truly shocking decision, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned their convictions and ordered a brand new trial. The reason? A legal technicality. The court decided the trial judge had made a mistake by not allowing certain evidence, specifically the children's original statements to social workers, which the defense claimed were essential to their case. The decision was a gut punch to the Corbett family and sparked outrage in Ireland. It set the stage for a second trial. But that second trial never happened. In October 2023, right before it was about to start, the Martens were offered a plea deal. Tom Martens pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Molly Martens entered a plea of no contest to the same charge, which, in the eyes of the law, is the same as a guilty plea. The sentencing that followed was, if possible, even more shocking. The judge sentenced them to a minimum of 51 months, but then gave them credit for the 44 months they had already served. That left them with just a few more months to go. In June of 2024, after serving just over 4 years for the brutal killing of Jason Corbett, Molly and Tom Martens walked out of prison as free people. For so many, the legal saga ended not with justice, but with a plea deal that felt like a complete betrayal of Jason Corbett's memory. So, the legal case is closed and the killers are free. What are we left with? We're left with the evidence. And if we follow that evidence to its logical conclusion, we can put together a version of that night that makes a hell of a lot more sense than the one Molly and Tom Martens told. This wasn't some spontaneous argument that got out of hand. The evidence points to this being a planned, deliberate attack. Tom Martens didn't just happen to have a baseball bat. He brought it upstairs as a weapon. The attack likely started in the bedroom, possibly while Jason was in bed, completely blindsided by the violence that was about to rain down on him. The first blow, maybe from the bat in Tom's hands, was likely fast and incapacitating. The blood spatter doesn't lie. Jason went down to the floor, where the assault became a frenzied, sustained beating. Molly, with that concrete paver, joined in. They hit him again and again and again, way beyond any definition of self-defense, crushing his skull to make sure he was dead. Once Jason was dead, phase 2 of their plan began, the cover-up. There was a delay before they called 911, giving them time to sync up their stories and stage the scene. Molly started rubbing her neck, getting into character as a victim. When Tom finally made the call, he was calm and collected, delivering his lines like the trained FBI agent he was. They had their story, and they were sticking to it. They gambled that the word of a young woman and her respected father would be enough to beat the physical evidence. They created a story of Jason as a monster, a story they hoped would be supported by the coach statements of his own orphan children. This wasn't a tragedy born from a fight. This was an ambush. It was a brutal murder, driven by a desperate need to control Jason's children and his money, carried out with horrifying violence, and followed by a cold, calculated attempt to manipulate the justice system. In the end, the American justice system let Molly and Tom Martens walk free after serving a tiny fraction of their original sentence. For Jason's family, his friends, and especially for his 2 children, Jack and Sarah, it's an outcome that's impossible to square with the evidence. His sister, Tracy Lynch, who has fought relentlessly for his name, said it best. They didn't just murder Jason. They tried to destroy his character, but they failed. The forensic evidence, the 12-plus blows, the blood spatter showing he was hit while on the ground, the perfect condition of his attackers, it all points to one inescapable conclusion. This was not self-defense. The story of Jason Corbett is a tragedy on so many levels. It's the story of a father ripped away from his children, of a family destroyed by violence, and of a justice system that, to many, completely failed. But it's also a story about the power of truth. Because while his killers may be free, the evidence they left behind will forever tell the real story of what happened on that dark night in North Carolina. The truth can't be beaten into silence or erased by a plea deal. The truth remains. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe the evidence points to self-defense? Or do you believe, like so many others, that this was a calculated and brutal murder? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.